My name is Itamar. I'm part of a group that's called People Tech Partners. It is just a group of business leaders, specifically in the HR space, that are doing a lot of work, just supporting the introduction of new HR technologies and basically supporting work that moves our discipline forward. And I'm here today with Thomas and Naomi, who are leading a startup called Trybe. Trybe is a soft skills training company with their own proprietary practice technology. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. And also, in the spirit of inclusion, there's another really important member of this panel. Erica is a doctoral candidate at the Wharton School of Business. And she's actually, in the spirit of inclusivity, joining us remotely. We have her actually mostly recorded because setting this up live would have been a little tricky. And before we jump into kind of like the discussion of topic for today, I just wanted to frame things a little bit. So we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is what the DE&I acronym that's on the title slide actually talks about. And those three things, actually, when we talk about like how do we implement them in a business context inside our organization, we usually need to move three different levers. We move diversity usually through changes to our hiring process. We move equity primarily through changes to our policies in our internal programs. So think about like pay analysis, promotion analysis, a lot of the really cool stuff that was presented earlier on today. And then when we talk about inclusion, this is really when we're talking about changing behavior. And this is the primary focus for today's panel. We need to move the needle on all of those three things, usually at the same time. We've seen a lot of companies that ended up neglecting one or more of those. But the focus of today's conversation is really on that latter piece, which is inclusion in how do we actually credibly move the needle on that. So I want to start with Erica actually first. And while we see actually a lot of new energy and sort of like awareness and conversation around the field of DEI, training in this space is becoming more and more popular. We're also starting to see some pretty interesting evidence that some of the best practices, so to speak, around what should you do if you want to move this business forward, are actually not working. And in some cases are actually setting ourselves back. So Erica, I was hoping, can tell us a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Itamar. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be speaking with you all today, even though I am speaking with you at a distance of many miles and quite a bit of time, since I'm recording this the night before the panel. Hopefully your experience is not significantly worsened by the fact that you have to listen to me without seeing me there. I wish I could, see your faces and respond to your questions directly, but I know that our team here will do a great job of handling anything that is unclear at the end of the panel. So Itamar, as you mentioned, DEI is increasingly gaining attention from the popular press. And this is especially true given recent overt displays of bias towards customers. So a prime example of this happened for me very close to home because I'm from Wharton, which is obviously in Philadelphia. And last year, Philadelphia Starbucks kicked out and actually had 2 Black customers arrested for loitering because they were waiting for their friends at the Starbucks and had not yet bought anything. Of course, this is treatment that many white customers who have exhibited the same behavior did not receive. And not long after that, only a few months after that, a friend of mine was made fun of for his stutter by a barista at another Philadelphia Starbucks. Of course, the company had to respond. There was a public outcry, several weeks, maybe even months of protesting. And the way the company responded was kind of par for the course. They they had a massive shutdown, and they said, okay, for this day, all Starbucks across the country will be closed for an unconscious bias training. And Sephora recently did a similar thing. There is a sense in the media that unconscious bias training might fix everything that a company has done wrong. But at the time, there was no research at all indicating whether this training was effective. Everything that had been published on diversity training, while some of it was great work, was observational or correlational. And that means that there was no causal evidence. So correlational studies can be great for kind of documenting what's happening in the world, but they can't establish causality. A very common refrain when you're working on statistics or working on experiments is that correlation does not imply causation. And this is because when you're just looking at patterns of co-occurring effects, you don't know what other confounds could be creating those effects. So let me illustrate that with an example. Imagine that you are running a study on diversity training, and you look at offices of the same organization that have run diversity trainings for all of their employees in some locations and not in others. And the employees in the locations where the diversity trainings were run happen to then be less biased a month later, where bias was determined by giving them a survey and asking them about their attitudes towards women or towards racial minorities. So there are two issues with this research. First, correlation does not imply causation. So just because there's a significant difference between the offices that took the unconscious bias training and those that didn't, doesn't mean that the differences are arising because of the unconscious bias training. So there was no random assignment, and what might be happening is that the diversity training was delivered in offices where the people already cared enough about being inclusive and promoting diversity to create the training in the first place and to deliver the training in the first place, right? So imagine, for example, that it's Corp X. Corp X has offices on the East Coast and the West Coast, and maybe the West Coast is much more progressive on issues of diversity and inclusion, and all the West Coast offices took the unconscious bias training and the East Coast offices didn't. It doesn't really tell you anything if there's less bias in the West Coast offices, because it could just be about the people there and not about the diversity training, right? So that's issue number one. That's just one example. There are many possible confounds. Could be seasonality, mood, whatever you can think of. And the second issue is that you're measuring attitudinal data, right? And this doesn't tell you that much about people's behavior, which we know matters a lot for creating company culture, for creating the environment that people feel is either inclusive or hostile. And also, when you're measuring people's attitudes, you're much more likely to measure something that we call social desirability. So when you're asking people about gender or race, they know what their answers should be to be politically correct or to fit in with what people want to hear from them. And this might lead them to lie a little bit about their true attitudes. So what we care about primarily is measuring behavior, because that tells you a lot more, first, about the impact on the office culture, and second, about what people might actually be thinking.
So last year, a group of really superstar researchers from the Wharton School of Business, so names that many of you might be familiar with, that team included Adam Grant, Angela Duckworth, Katie Milkman, actually set out to solve this problem and actually design one of the first field studies out there that were meant to look at actually the causality link between diversity training and its impacts. Can you tell us a little bit more about what they study and what they found out?
And the way we want to resolve this, and the way the prior study run by my colleagues at Wharton, which was extremely innovative, resolved this was first by using random assignment. So when you're randomly assigning people to either receive an unconscious bias training or not, you are controlling for any differences across the samples, because random assignment should evenly spread out those differences. And that is the only way that you can really determine causality. And then they also wanted to have behavioral measures rather than just having attitudinal measures. So what my partners did at Wharton was partner with a massive corporation to launch a randomized trial, so think kind of like a drug trial, to test the effectiveness of unconscious bias training. Because of the size of the corporation, they got to access international as well as US samples, and participants in the experiment all took a knowledge-based leadership training with content curated by Wharton researchers. So importantly, everything in the leadership training was based on research from psychology, economics, or management, and participants were exposed to the best of the research. So this wasn't just a thrown together haphazard diversity training. My colleagues were really trying to make the best training they could think of. And indeed, the training was interactive. It involved video lessons from top scholars in our field. Participants had to imagine their own behavior in a variety of scenarios, and they were taught whether that behavior was adaptive for creating an inclusive environment or not. And these employees, these participants, were randomly assigned to either take a leadership training about unconscious bias in the workplace, which is the test, the treatment, or one about active listening and psychological safety, and that was the control. And like many unconscious bias trainings, it was a 1-hour online experience. And as I mentioned, unlike some of those trainings, it was a very carefully curated 1-hour experience. One of the incredible aspects of the study that I alluded to earlier is that my colleagues not only measured attitudes after the training, they also measured concrete behaviors. So specifically, they were comparing the behavior of the people who got the unconscious bias training, the random sample of people, to the random sample of people who did not, who got the psychological safety training instead. And that way, they could say that any differences they saw across the two samples were due to the differences in training, because the two samples were perfectly balanced across characteristics, any characteristic you could think of. So you might be wondering what those behaviors were. They focused on mentorship and peer nominations. So in particular, they were looking at something called coffee connectivity, where people were asked to join a program where they could connect with their colleagues over coffee, and they were measuring which colleagues people asked to connect with and how many of them were women or racial minorities. And then they looked at peer nominations for recognition for excellence. And again, they were looking at who was nominated and by whom. And again, by comparing behavior across the control group of employees who received a training unrelated to unconscious bias and the test group or the treatment group who received an unconscious bias training, they could isolate whether there were any effects of unconscious bias training on attitudes and behavior. And unfortunately, their results were pretty grim. There was a small shift in attitudes for the groups that had been most biased before, but very little behavior change. And the biggest change in behavior was that women who had received unconscious bias training were more likely to actively seek out mentorship. So there was no evidence of people being good allies. There was evidence instead of people advocating for themselves. And this particular study found null effects, which means that there was no movement on behavior. But past correlational research has actually found backlash effects. And I discussed the issues with correlational research, so we don't want to read into it too much. But this does suggest that, at best, these unconscious bias trainings are doing nothing. And at worst, they could even lead to some major issues. And now I don't want to say completely nothing, because it is really important that women were more likely to advocate for themselves and to seek out mentorship. We really value that. But we want bigger behavior change. And that is where our partnership with Trybe comes in.
Yeah, and I think, pretty grim results and not the results that I think any of us in the room was sort of hoping for. So Thomas, over to you, kind of like roughly at the same time, 5,000 miles away on the West Coast, this company called Trybe is kind of like starting to take shape and evolve. Tell us a little bit about what Trybe is.
Awesome. I'm very, very excited to share a bit about Trybe. Also just want to say thank you to everyone for engaging with that. I know listening to your voice is really difficult, but Itamar, thank you for making that connection, because we just thought hearing from the research and setting up why we were doing this was so important. But I love how you put that. 5,000 miles ago, Trybe.ai was just coming forth as a professional skill development company focused on changing the way we learn. And so fundamentally, we at Trybe believe that professionals look a lot more like business athletes today than factory line workers. If you think about the complexity and ever-changing scenarios we have to deal with, the focus and dedication that it requires in order to be excellent, that stuff requires you to be at your peak in a way that we never have before. And so what we do at Trybe is we combine classic training models like workshops, interactive experiential workshops, and coaching with a practice element that hopefully builds muscle memory around these new skills. Now, anyone who you talk to today who's kind of worth their salt in the world of training is going to talk to you about the importance of practice and reinforcement in terms of leading to long-lasting behavior change. The difference for us at Trybe is that we can deliver and measure that. So 60% of Trybe users are daily active users on our practice and data platform that we lovingly call our brain gym, that they use to practice these new skills. And the reason for that is kind of not rocket science, and it didn't kind of come by magic. It's because we primarily see ourselves as a consumer product company first. And so we prioritize designing learning solutions that our learners are going to love. And they love them so much that the average Trybe user is practicing a new skill or reflecting on the lesson that they're learning about 4.3 times a week. Now, if you think about any new skill that you're hoping to build in the next quarter to achieve your goals, is it your executive presence? Is it kind of managing up with your executive team? Is it feedback with your team? If you could commit to spending 4 days a week on that thing for the next 8 weeks, how difficult would it be for you to not be better at that in a measurable way in 2 months, right? That's not just us, that's the Homo sapien brain. That's the power of Trybe. And so we focus that behavior change power on the area of learning that we believe has the most impact on your productivity and your performance. And so the bulk majority of our work actually focuses on DEI. Well, actually, I'll phrase that again. I actually changed the way I think about that. DEI is both one of the things that we focus on as well as the lens through which all our learning content comes through. And the reason for that, and particularly that change in terms of our way of thinking, is that as we look at the science, the number one investment that any business can make in its productivity is in building a more inclusive organization. That has been proven time and time again over the last 10 years. I think most recent report from McKinsey just came out saying exactly the same thing we have just last year. But additionally, the number one leadership development skill for your people, given our increasingly global and diverse world, is the ability to lead diverse teams. And so there's just such a clear business imperative for investing here. But for us at Trybe, this is also deeply personal. So for me, it all has to do with growing up gay and poor in Kenya. And so when I was growing up, who I was alternatively something that didn't exist, something that was a capital offense, or something that was worth a lifetime imprisonment. And so when I stepped off the plane at 18 at the US for the first time as an immigrant with exactly $275 to my name, achieving my professional aspirations was as much about my survival as it was about self-actualization. Now, I had the opportunity, I was able to teach myself the SATs. I earned a diversity scholarship to go to college, without which I would never have been able to afford any college, let alone Stanford. And that began to open doors for me that has built this incredible career in learning strategy and product design. Being able to work at places like the Boston Consulting Group, LinkedIn, and now being a founder here at Trybe. And that's changed not just my life, but my family's life as well. But I know it's also really personal for Naomi, and I'm gonna put her on the spot a little bit, just to give you guys a sense of who we are. Naomi actually started with a pretty broken education. She'd been to 10 different schools before she dropped out of high school at about 16. And she was so far behind in school that she had to start with arithmetic when she started community college. But Naomi is one of the most resilient people I know. It's one of the reasons I've worked with her across 2 companies. And she was able to work her way from community college to Berkeley, where she majored in mechanical engineering, and then on to MIT for grad school, where she became a roboticist, and has since built this incredible career around engineering and learning science at places like Khan Academy, McKinsey, Pixar, and now together here at Trybe. And I just share those stories because for us, climbing these really tall and steep mountains is really personal. And building solutions and learning solutions that hopefully build the kind of inclusive environments that create space for people like us, that allow anyone to achieve their peak performance, that help diverse businesses win, is our reason for being.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that, Tom.
And just to kind of like bring us back to this like the essential part that practice is playing in driving that kind of behavior change. A couple of years ago, I was the head of people at a startup that's now called Altitude Learning. Back then it was called AltSchool. It's a very innovative ed tech company. And it was the first time that I, as a head of people, had access to people that were truly deeply steeped in the science of learning. So people that are, proud to carry the title of a pedagogist. And it was just incredible to me, and like just eye-opening to see if kind of I benchmark the kind of learning experience that we were creating for K through 8 kids versus the kind of trainings that were available to me as an employee or as an adult, just seeing the gap in methodology and how much value is being left on the table in your kind of like run-in-the-mill learning and development experience. And which I think is actually a good segue, Naomi, to you. You read the Wharton study, you hear about it, and like something clicks for you. What was clicking?
Yeah, thank you for that. And just really quickly to introduce myself, I'm Naomi Davidson. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Trybe. Sorry, I'm very loud. Thank you so much for that really beautiful introduction to what we're all about, Thomas, because I think it's going to explain why I had a very strong reaction to that study. And it was, thank God, that somebody actually measured this and did such an incredible job of how they measured it. To me, this is a classic scenario, and I was aware of the problem for a pretty long time. I know that we're not dealing with a knowledge issue here. Unconscious bias is just that. It's unconscious. And so at McKinsey and at LinkedIn, where I have been responsible for leading company-wide change initiatives for many years, I'm actually quite familiar with the push that you often get from the business to put sort of undue focus on training as a way to achieve change management. And I know as a change expert that the way that you actually get change to stick is by changing mindsets and behaviors. Knowledge is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so that's going to be especially true in a case where you are dealing with something as deeply ingrained as cultural and personally held unconscious bias. It takes us all of our lives to develop this. So it was such a relief to see this incredibly beautiful study that was pulled together with such great care, with so much intellectual curiosity, both in building what was a really excellent training. I'm so glad that Erica went into the details of that. I've taken the training myself. It's really quite impressively built. And then measuring outcomes with almost a clinical level quality. I was blown away. And I hoped that it would help advance the conversation. I hope that it would help get folks like us here today, practitioners in this field, vendors, everybody really starting to ask the question, what happens if we keep going down this path, right? We're putting all of this energy into diversity, hiring. We're spending a lot of money on benefits packages and other things. But most people that I talk to, and I talk to a lot of companies in the past 2 months, I've talked to 20 companies. Most of the companies that I'm talking to are doing exactly, at best, they're doing what Erica talked about. And so what happens if we keep doing that? And unfortunately, I think that answer is really not rosy. Cultural backlash is a real thing. Cultural churn is a real thing. Getting a reputation for being a company that is ineffectively or disingenuinely investing in inclusion could be ruinous for a company. And in fact, I have a story from LinkedIn where the first rounds of investments that LinkedIn made, and they were made with great earnestness and with a lot of effort and with a lot of investment, and they focused on awareness building. Unfortunately, they built a lot of awareness, but they did not deliver on any outcomes that were visible to the communities that they were aimed at. These were the Black and Latinx communities in particular. And so the attrition rates actually increased for that community. And I happen to know that the reputation that they built amongst that class was pretty poor. So that you actually hear people talking, I've heard friends talking quite negatively about LinkedIn, although I know that LinkedIn is working really hard to turn that around and coming at it again with full force. How many companies are really struggling, I think really struggling with this question, where they're struggling to get their diverse hires to progress, right? It's sort of like they invited everybody over to the wedding, and they've opened up the doors, and they sort of like maybe have one room fixed, but the next rooms are not open to get to you as a guest yet, but other people are allowed to go in. And so that's something pretty visible, right? You notice that you're not allowed. And people are noticing. For example, we ran a course at Stanford last year. There were 40 professionals, investing in their performance development, leadership performance. And we asked them, how many of you feel that you have either seen somebody be overlooked, or you yourself have been overlooked, and you felt that the reason for that was based on your gender or your race. And all but 2 of them said yes, that that's something that they'd either seen for themselves or for other people around them. So people are noticing, and the expectations are raising. And so as Thomas outlined, we're a company that cares a lot about this. We've dedicated our lives really to quality and impact. For us, the bar is measurable change, and I have a robotics background, so I take that really seriously. And so what are the fundamentals of changing mindsets and behaviors? It's not rocket science, really. It's just over time with reinforcement and practice, right? These are the things we all know. It's the basics. You can't get around it. That's just what it takes. And there's tons of neuroscience and learning science and organizational psychology. Everything is going to tell you that you need practice. As Thomas said, everybody knows you need practice. It's really how do you get people to practice, right? And that's where the product development comes in. But I'll just highlight, Katie Milkman's work, just because she's been mentioned here, that the #1 best way to get people to change their behavior is to remind them regularly to do the thing that they should be doing. So people know they struggle to do, right? And so the big thing that when I saw this study, the big thing that clicked for me is we got to do the second study. So I reached out to Edward Chang, who was the then PhD candidate, now professor at Harvard, to propose to him that we do a follow-on study, and that this time we take a practice-based approach, both to the training, and of course, because that's the Trybe methodology, we really believe in that. Sorry, I hope I'm not yelling really loud. Take a practice-based approach, not just to the training, but also to the reinforcement and practice following up with this brain gym. And see if this more cognitive behavioral approach to learning actually shows impact in outcomes. And so what we're really saying is let's change mindsets by changing behaviors and then reflecting on the effects of that. That's really a cognitive behavioral approach, right? So the example would be, go out and make friends with people who are different from you. Go out and try to engage with difference, and then notice your biases and challenge your biases, as opposed to becoming very aware of your biases and then trying to go out and make friends with people who are different from you, which I would argue is a much harder path. So anyway, that was the impetus for the study and what he agreed to.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's just so much riding on these DEI efforts, and I just don't think that we have the luxury of just kind of like, let's just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and kind of like see what works and what doesn't. Like, I think given how critical this is, we owe it to ourselves to, stand on the shoulders of giant, which is, everything that science has taught us today, and like make smart bets that are science informed about what is actually likely to work.
So well
And
said.
so that's a great segue just to go back to you, Arika, because this is when you are joining this merry group of individuals. Can you tell us a little bit more about the study that's being designed together?
Yes, gladly. So we wanted to work with Trybe to create an experiment that would allow us to determine whether there are any causal effects of an unconscious bias training that is focused on behavior change on diversity and inclusion-related behaviors. And in particular, what we're hoping to test are the effects of consistent micropractice. And as Naomi highlighted, there is a lot of reason to believe from past research on behavior change that micropractice might be the key to helping people unlock the benefits of diversity training. So we know from past work that 1 hour diversity training isn't quite enough, but we're hoping, and we believe in Trybe's product, that having this micropractice might do the trick, and it might help people capitalize on their learning and change their behavior. So where Edward and I come in is helping to design a randomized trial that will rigorously allow us to isolate the causal effects of this micropractice. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this panel, randomization is important in order to make sure that we actually can make causal inferences. So what we're doing is splitting up employees in our study to randomly receive either immediate training and practice, or immediate training and then a delayed practice intervention after enough weeks that the treatment or test employees are able to do the micropractice and exhibit any behaviors that we want to test. And then after that, we'll come in and give the rest the micropractice.
Yeah. And you know, we're running out of time. There's a whole other section and we're not going to get a chance to go into today of kind of like really double clicking in how do you actually effectively measure behavior. That's another super cool thing that we'd love to nerd out with you on afterwards.
As well as how do you build a cognitive behavioral learning? That's something that we were going to go through as well, which I think might be really interesting, is how do you really start from the behavior and work backwards. But in the interest of time.
Yes.
One thing we wanted to make sure that you guys all got is what better way to kind of learn this than experience it. So on your desks, you should all see a gift from us. We actually want to give each of you 2 slots for you and someone else at your company to check out this cognitive behavioral learning. See it for yourself. What does it look like to engage with a training on inclusion, but that's really based on the latest science? And it's also going to come with 2 free weeks to that practice and data platform, the Brain Gym, so you can get a chance to see it for yourself. Our hope is that, 1, you give us a ton of incredible feedback on what works for you and what doesn't. And 2, hopefully that if you are interested, that maybe you'd consider adding your companies to the study. Because we are looking for other participants to really help us understand the science of what's truly going to drive lasting impact here. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Do we have any time for questions?
Yeah, actually, fantastic. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing what you do. It's spectacular. So yeah, I'm honored that you're here. My question is this, everything that you're sharing, like with Dr. Pepper this morning, like makes sense. It's right on. It's like, but what is the barrier that you see within organizations to actually adopting this type of approach? Because who is it? Is it learning? Is it people analytics? Is it the CHRO? Is it this non-existent governance body? What do you see happening in the year or 2 ahead where, all right, the world is wised up and this is going to become a norm? Because again, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab, but what I see and what I've experienced at least is I think that the CHRO is in a tough spot. That it's a role that's been burned many times with rolling out ed tech, and the reputation for education technology and some other sort of more practice-based and evidence-based approaches have gotten them in trouble in the organization before. And unfortunately, exactly the thing that's making them kind of risk-averse is what's going to be one of the biggest impediments right now. And because of that sort of dynamic where they might not have the trust they need from the COO and the CEO to take some bets, to take some risks, and because they're going to start measuring and they're going to see that things aren't working. And that's a tough thing. That's the first thing you find when you launch things and you start measuring them, is you start seeing all the dust bunnies that are under the bed, and nobody likes to look at that. And it's tough if you don't have the credibility and the analytical chops to be able to defend what you're looking at and speak to it credibly. So I think that's one of the biggest factors. we take a very consultative approach to what we do because we recognize that's what they're up against. Being able to help them go to those tables and go toe-to-toe with a COO or a CTO even and speak to the analytics. And I think actually it's the people here who are going to be one of the biggest helpers in that conversation because they need all the armament that they can get in showing the credibility and also having the guts to look at it when it's failing, because it's not all going to be roses when you turn it on and you start seeing what's going on, right? You're going to have some minerals at that moment.
We haven't had a chance to clearly coordinate on that, but I'm just amazing how much we're mind melding on this. My short answer was fear of failure. There's so much anxiety, especially around learning and development, to kind of bring in the big brand names to present a learning and development experience that's fully integrative and fully holistic and touches everything, is addresses all of your needs. And it's tough to kind of take the risk and saying, no, I'm gonna go best of breed here, and I know that it might not work, but it's actually likely to just as much drive the impact that you're actually looking for. It's a lot easier to say, let's just do unconscious bias training because Facebook and Google does that, right? Yeah.
Like an oversensitivity.
I can take a stab at that, and then I'm curious. One of the first things in the science of unconscious bias is we all have it. So there's this kind of thing that we hear the word bias and we think of it as this awful, evil thing. Bias is an evolutionary trait that all Homo sapiens have that allow us to make really fast decisions. It's simply heuristics, right? If I feel, if you notice that there's a fire over there, you'll probably have a bias to run in that direction. That is a very, very good thing. A challenge with unconscious biases are what are the biases that we don't realize that are influencing our decisions, but they always are. So I think the solution I often propose, and is very much based here, is less on us picking who has the bias and who doesn't. We all do, right? And every test come in. The question is, what's the behavior we want to have? And how might bias be getting in the way of that? But once again, a lot of the studies show that the way that you do that doesn't start by looking at your biases, which we all have. Let's think about our behaviors and set the vision of where we want to go. And what we'll often find is that that new behavior starts challenging those biases, and they change with us.
Yeah. I think to me it's more about how do you build the skill around truth seeking, right? I think we have a misconception about how we form our beliefs.
Right.
We actually form our beliefs by hearing something and assuming that it's true, until in some cases we actually get some evidence that presents the other. So adopting this new behavior of being really reflective about your beliefs, and rather than taking them as assumed to be true, as assumed to be false, or being willing to hold them with curiosity, and going to seek out information that's actually going to support or invalidate your belief. I think that's the kind of meta behavior change that we're trying to drive. And guess what? You know what's the best way to get there? Through practice.
Practice,
so,
exactly.
Yeah.
One thing just to quickly add to that, I would say that I think it is really important to build a strong culture of feedback. And one of the first things that's really important in a culture, building a strong culture of feedback, is helping people to understand that it's not just about giving it, it's also about receiving it. And so if you focus on people in terms of truth seeking on the truth that they're giving, you often end up with this point and shoot culture, as opposed to a culture that is one of, hey, we're all doing our best here. We're all trying, and we're all making mistakes. And yes, I made a mistake. And thank you for raising that with me, right? And help me understand. But then also being, part of a culture where, you're soliciting that feedback frequently, and people feel that it's part of how you interact. Your job isn't just to point and shoot. Your job is to be part of a conversation.